is that when Jesus teaches and preaches, he's teaching and preaching to a predominantly Jewish audience. In doing so, notice how, as Matthew's gospel, written for a Gentile Jewish community, harkens back to the core of what the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament, is really about. Deuteronomy says, that's the first quote, love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Meaning that as God has created us in the divine image, that every part of us must be defined by God, down to the ends of our fingernails, to whatever hair we might have left on the top of our head, to the ends of our toes. Every part of us must be defined by God. And if we are to love God and know that God is love, then you see every part of us must be defined by love. For the Jewish community over the centuries, they ended up with 618 laws that were intended to define what that meant, so that every part of your life was captured by that image of God, by the character, by the righteousness of God. If that was true, then as Leviticus says, then we cannot help but love our neighbor as much as we might love ourselves. We know in comparative religions today that that so-called golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, that is at the heart of that text in Leviticus, is present within all the religions of the world. So it must be a universal truth as well as a foundational truth for humanity, that for us within the Judeo-Christian tradition, if God is love and every aspect of us is to be defined by love, then we must consistently, constantly be moved to love others. And we know, right? Not just neighbors in terms of those who are like us, those who look like us, talk like us, dress like us, might have the same skin color as we have. But we know that neighbor includes everyone, even those that we might find distasteful in associating with. That was what the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel is all about. Even the Samaritans are our neighbors. Even those that we don't trust, don't like, and might find a bit strange and unusual, they're our neighbors. That's the vision. I think that's the vision that Jesus preached, even to this Jewish audience, to awaken in them, once again, a sense of this grand vision of God who brought them out of slavery in Egypt and brought them into a land of promise and hope and freedom. That was the vision. That was the teaching. As the Christian community began to grow and expand, it encountered a whole new world and had to find its way to adapt to that new world. So that Matthew is a gospel struggling with trying to remain in that Jewish vision and tradition, but also be open enough, embracing enough, welcoming enough to include Gentiles who had a whole nother worldview. Their worldview was that gods and goddesses existed just about everywhere. Their worldview was, well, in a sense, out of that Greco-Roman worldview, there was almost a better sense of what the human person and the relationship that the person had to the creation and to the universe. So Matthew's community already begins to show that the message of Jesus not being changed in its essence, but that the message of Jesus had to find a way to adapt and include a whole new way of thinking and a whole new way of understanding. If you look at history, that as Christianity expands and grows, it was faced with many situations in which it had to change, had to adapt, had to expand its awareness and its self-understanding, not just in order to survive, but in order to be true to the vision and teachings of Jesus and the name of God. What happened is that over that period of time, and I find it troubling actually for myself that when we even talk about the Reformation, we're only talking about less than 50% of the world was involved with this. only Western Europe. And by extension, Western Europe to North America, South America. Meaning, if you know anything about China in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, they were in many ways farther ahead than anything going on in Western Europe. So we've excluded the whole worldview of the Oriental or Asian people. We've not even talking about what was going on in India, let alone in the Incan, Mayan, Aztec empires in the New World. So it's kind of interesting that we have this arrogance of worldview that we think that how we look at the world, how we understand God, must be the way everybody thinks. If you've had any encounter with anybody in your travels to a different Asia, Africa, India, South America, you realize these people think differently than we do. Isn't that amazing? So which vision, then, do we work with? I say this because this is really important. That if Christianity, if the norm of Christianity has been to change, adapt, expand, include, and at times retreat, withdraw, and defense in a defensive mode against these new ideas, I want to ask which one really represents the true vision of the reign of God. Is it withdrawing in memory back to the way things were? Or is it to always be open and embracing, not just to something new for innovation's sake, but to be open to embracing different points of view, different perspectives, even, in a sense, different values, different witnesses to those values? That may trouble us greatly. But you see, I think that's what the vision of the reign of God is. The phrase that I used for the sermon title was Semper Reformanda. And while I thought that that went back to Martin Luther, little did I know that it actually was something that Karl Barth suggested. Anybody know Karl Barth? I don't know. I grew up Catholic, and I never heard of Karl Barth until I was in the seminary.
I do.
There you go. Andrew knows who Karl Barth is. What it means is that perhaps the best, the truth is that when we stay the same, when we maintain a defensiveness against the world and new ideas, that we're not really representing the truth of the gospel. The core value is love God and love neighbor. It's actually pretty simple. It's not complicated, not difficult. But as many people are sitting here today, there are as many interpretations of what that means. If that's true, then you see why the church has to keep an openness to the world. It's interesting, growing up Catholic, that when Vatican II came along, everybody thought that Vatican II was simply going to restate what had happened before. And John the 23rd said it has to be, in the Italian word was aggiornamento. And what aggiornamento meant was to open the windows so that the fresh air in the world could come into the church to refresh the church. So that in opening to the world, we could embrace what was good in the world, instead of always thinking that the world was bad, evil, corrupt, sinful. So that in opening the window, we could learn from science. We could understand the universe. We could not see that evolution stands in contradiction, but in coordination with, in partnership with what we understood the book of Genesis to be about. It's interesting that later people in the Roman church said, oh no, it wasn't to open windows so the fresh air of the world could come into the church. It was so that we opened the windows so that Christ could get out into the world to change the world. So there were already people in the Roman church not wanting to embrace openness. As much as people in our own denomination, in our own church, that over the generations have also not wanted to embrace change and openness. Whether it was when the first woman came forward to be ordained, I would bet that there were people who absolutely refused to embrace that woman, and probably that day when she got up in the pulpit to preach, walked out. I bet there were. But the church went on. And the first time that an openly gay partnered man got up in the pulpit to preach, I bet there were people who walked out of the church. And some stayed, and the church went on. And when we became open and affirming, there were people who walked away. And we survive and go on. You see what that tells me? That we are closer to the truth when we are open to still speaking God and are able to change, not the core values, but to understand that the core values are intended to keep us focused on the teachings of Jesus. And if the teachings of Jesus are love your neighbor as yourself, embrace the poor, the needy, the outcast, and that is closer to what we need to be as church than when we are defensive, closed off, and turn our backs on the world. The invitation is to continue to reform and renew. And one last point. This is what we're trying to do with our strategic vision, with a rethinking of our bylaws and the structure of our church and how we're going to support ourselves financially. That's what we're trying to do. How will we respond, not to the way the church was 35 years ago, but to the way the church is now? And who are we going to be now as witnesses and disciples of Jesus Christ?